Quiet on the set. Roll camera. And action.
Picture this. A motion picture set somewhere in the Mojave Desert, 47 miles southeast of Barstow, California. The year is 1960. The temperature on the sand is 114 degrees Fahrenheit. There are 87 crew members standing in place. Grips, gaffers, a continuity girl with a clipboard pressed against her chest, a camera operator who has been in Hollywood for 19 years and has never, not once, seen anything like what he is about to see. The camera is rolling. The director is in his chair. The slate has been called, and John Wayne is walking away. Not toward his mark. Not toward craft services. Not toward the shade tent where the second assistant director has been standing with a cold towel for 20 minutes. He is walking away from the set, away from the camera, away from a production that is costing $47,000 a day to run. And he is not looking back. The director calls cut. The 87 crew members go still. Nobody speaks. The camera operator sets down his eyepiece and watches the largest man on the lot disappear over a low ridge of hardpan rock and desert scrub, his shadow stretched long by the morning sun behind him. Someone asks quietly, "What did he see?" Nobody answers. This is that story. To understand what John Wayne saw that Tuesday morning on July 12, 1960, you need to understand the world he was moving through. The world that made the moment not just possible, but inevitable. The production was the Comancheros. 20th Century Fox had greenlit the picture in late 1959, based on Paul Wellman's 1952 novel of the same name. The budget was $3.2 million, significant money for a Western in that era, when the genre was fighting for survival against the television cowboys who were flooding American living rooms every Tuesday and Saturday night. The studio brass wanted this one to look massive, to feel authentic, to remind audiences why you still needed a movie screen to see John Wayne properly. Director Michael Curtiz had been assigned the film. His credentials were, by any measure, formidable. Curtiz had directed 163 motion pictures over 40 years. He had won the Academy Award for Casablanca in 1943. He had worked with Errol Flynn on 8 productions, with Doris Day on 4, with James Cagney, Humphrey Bogart, and Olivia de Havilland. He was 72 years old, and he had seen everything Hollywood had ever produced, including the difficult actors, the difficult locations, and the difficult combinations of both. Curtiz was also dying. He had been diagnosed with multiple myeloma, bone marrow cancer, in late 1959, and the cast and senior crew knew it, though it was not discussed openly on set. The man who showed up every morning at 5:45 a.m. in the Mojave was running on something beyond professional obligation. He was finishing. He knew it. And knowing it made him demanding in a way that exceeded even his legendary reputation for relentlessness on set. He would push the cast through a setup 9, 10, 11 times in the desert heat. He would call for repositioned cameras when the light had already turned and the shadows were wrong. He had a habit of standing behind the camera operator and breathing loudly when he was dissatisfied, which he usually was. The secondary cast and the crew extras, many of them hired out of a pool of 340 men brought up from the Barstow area, had been on set since the first week of July. By the morning of the 12th, they were tired. Not professionally tired. Physically depleted. The catering trucks ran out of cold water twice in the first week, and the replacement supply took 6 hours to arrive. Men who had been sitting in full cavalry costume in direct sunlight since 7 a.m. were developing heat rashes and short tempers. But here's where it changes. And this is the part of the story that most accounts leave out entirely. Among those 340 extras and day players, there were 22 men who were not professional actors at all. They were working cowboys. Real ones. Men who had come down from ranches near Victorville and Apple Valley, hired through a livestock coordinator named Harlan Bates, because the production needed riders who could handle horses in terrain that would have unnerved a stuntman. These were not men accustomed to being arranged and rearranged by a Hungarian director with an accent so thick it sometimes took 3 repetitions to understand his instructions. They had been patient. For 11 days, they had been patient. What the production log records for the morning of July 12th, in the sparse language of official documentation, is the following. Delay, 9:47 a.m., principal photography suspended, cause under review. 47 words. Nothing else. No explanation. No follow-up notation. What actually happened that morning? what those 87 crew members witnessed, and what none of them spoke about publicly for more than 3 decades, began not with John Wayne, but with a man named Roy Calhoun. Not the actor Rory Calhoun. A different man entirely. Roy Calhoun was a livestock wrangler, 44 years old, 6 feet tall, 195 pounds, and he had been working horses on film sets since he was 27. He knew the hierarchy of a film set, and he respected it, up to the point where it intersected with the welfare of animals that could not speak for themselves. At approximately 9:32 a.m. on the morning of July 12th, Roy Calhoun approached the first assistant director, a man named Gerald Foss, and told him, quietly, that one of the production horses had developed a significant stone bruise on its left foreleg and needed to be pulled from the day's riding schedule. The horse's name was General. It was a 9-year-old quarter-horse stallion, bay-colored, 15.2 hands tall, and it had been working the same 2-mile stretch of rocky hardpan since the 7th. Gerald Foss told Roy Calhoun that the schedule could not absorb a horse change. They would shoot around it, walk the horse slowly through the shot. It would be fine. Roy Calhoun told Gerald Foss that walking a horse with a stone bruise on rocky hardpan was not fine, that it would cause permanent structural damage to the hoof wall, that the horse would be lame within 48 hours if it was worked. Gerald Foss told Roy Calhoun that was his problem and the horse's problem, and would he please get back to his position. What happened next, nobody expected. Roy Calhoun said nothing. He walked back to where the horses were staged at the eastern edge of the set. He began removing General's bridle. And John Wayne, who had been standing 60 yards away near camera A, in his period costume, hat pulled low against the sun, apparently watching nothing, had seen all of it. He had not moved during the exchange between Calhoun and Foss. He had not turned to watch it directly. He stood with his weight on his left hip, his right thumb hooked in his gun belt, his eyes apparently fixed on the middle distance where the desert floor met the base of a low mesa. 6 feet 4 inches tall, 222 pounds. In full Texas Ranger costume, brown canvas jacket, cavalry boots, a hat that shaded his face to the jawline. To the second camera operator, a 28-year-old named Pete Armendariz Jr., whose father had worked with Wayne on 4 previous productions. Wayne appeared to be doing nothing. Waiting. Conserving energy against the heat. He had been standing in approximately that position for 11 minutes. But Armendariz Jr. would say, in an interview he gave in 1994 to a Western Film Preservation journal, that there was something in the quality of Wayne's stillness that was different from ordinary waiting. He said, the man wasn't resting. He was reading. There is a particular quality in the hands of men who have spent decades working with large animals. Wayne had started working with horses at the age of 17, when John Ford put him on a horse for a crowd scene on a picture Wayne was not even cast in. He had spent 31 years, by 1960, learning how horses moved, how they communicated discomfort, how they distributed weight when something in their body was wrong. He had ridden horses in 112 pictures. He had seen, personally, what happened when a production pushed a compromised horse past its limit on hard terrain. The size of his hands was something the wardrobe department noted on every production he worked. His glove size was a 10.5, the outer edge of what standard Western gloves could accommodate. But the thing about those hands was not their size. It was how still they were when he was paying attention. A man who is distracted fidgets. A man who is processing information goes very quiet, and his hands go quiet with him. His hands, on the morning of July 12th, were completely still. He watched Roy Calhoun begin removing General's bridle. He watched Gerald Foss turn his back and walk toward the director's position. He watched the first assistant camera operator reset a lens filter. He watched the continuity girl look up from her clipboard, look at Calhoun, look back at her clipboard. And then, this is the moment that Pete Armendariz Jr. describes with a precision that suggests it was burned into his memory. Wayne turned his head, very slowly, and looked directly at Michael Curtiz. Curtiz was 40 yards away, seated in his director's chair, speaking with the script supervisor. Wayne looked at him for 4 seconds. Then he set his coffee cup down on a nearby equipment case, set it down carefully, not dropped, not slammed, and he started walking. Not toward Curtiz, not toward Foss, toward Roy Calhoun and the horse. Gerald Foss saw Wayne moving and intercepted him at approximately the midpoint between camera A and the horse staging area. Foss was 38 years old, a veteran first AD with 14 years of production experience and a reputation for running tight sets. He had managed Kirk Douglas, he had managed Robert Mitchum, he had managed actors whose capacity for on-set difficulty was Hollywood legend. He said to Wayne, with the practiced authority of a man who had deployed that authority hundreds of times, "Duke, we're at least an hour behind. Curtiz needs you at the camera." Wayne did not look at Foss. He kept walking. Foss took 2 steps to keep pace with him and said louder, because they were now within earshot of perhaps 30 crew members, "The horse issue is handled. It's not your concern." Wayne stopped. He turned and looked at Gerald Foss for the first time. Foss would say later, to his wife, that something happened in that moment that he could not fully put into words. He was a practical man, not given to impressionism or sentiment. But he said that the way John Wayne looked at him was not like being looked at by another person on a film set. It was like being looked at by something that had decided to be patient with you for a specific and finite amount of time. Wayne said quietly, "Which part of it is handled?" The 30 crew members within earshot went still. Foss said the horse was manageable. That Calhoun was overreacting. That they had a schedule to maintain and a director who was not well and 340 people on this set who were depending on the production staying on track. Wayne listened to all of it. He nodded slowly once when Foss finished. Then he said, "I heard what Calhoun told you. That's not a scheduling problem. That's a horse that can't be ridden." He started walking again. There was a prop table roughly 8 feet to Foss's left. A grip named Charlie Weaver, who would tell this story at his retirement dinner in 1991 before a group of 60 industry colleagues, said that Foss reached out toward the table as if to steady himself and then stopped and just watched Wayne walk past him. Michael Curtiz had risen from his chair. He was watching from 40 yards away. He said nothing. Wayne reached Roy Calhoun at 9:44 a.m. He looked at the horse. He ran one hand along General's left foreleg from the knee down, taking perhaps 12 seconds to complete the examination. He straightened up. He looked at Calhoun and said, "How long has he been moving like this?" Calhoun said, "Since the 9th. 3 days." Wayne stood with his hand still resting on the horse's shoulder. He was silent for what Charlie Weaver estimated at 7 seconds, though he admitted it might have been 5 or 10, because time on that set, in that moment, had stopped operating normally for everyone watching. Then John Wayne turned, looked at the director's position where Curtiz was now standing, and began walking, not back toward the camera, but past it, past the equipment, past the shade tent and the catering truck, up and over the low ridge of hardpan rock and desert scrub. The camera was still rolling. Nobody called cut for 23 seconds. In the first second after Wayne disappeared over the ridge, nobody on the set moved. Not one of the 87 people in that production zone shifted position or spoke. In the second, Pete Armendariz Jr. looked through his camera eyepiece at nothing in particular. In the third second, the continuity girl's pencil stopped moving on her clipboard. In the fourth second, Michael Curtiz said, in a voice that carried with complete clarity in the desert silence, "Cut." But this is where you need to understand what was happening on the other side of that ridge. Because the story of John Wayne walking away is only half the story. The other half is what he did when he got there, and why it mattered in a way that reached far beyond one horse on one picture on one morning in the Mojave. Wayne walked 140 yards past the ridge to a place where the production vehicles were staged, a line of horse trailers, flatbeds, and crew trucks. He located the livestock veterinarian assigned to the production, a man named Dr. Carl Whitfield, based out of San Bernardino, on retainer to Fox at $180 a day, who was sitting in the cab of a production truck reading a copy of the Los Angeles Times. Wayne knocked on the window. Whitfield, who had been on the job for 9 days and had not once been consulted about any animal on the production, would describe this encounter in a letter he wrote in 1978 to a friend who was compiling recollections of the making of the Comancheros. He said Wayne did not introduce himself, did not need to, and did not explain the situation with elaborate context. He said, "There's a horse up there. Left foreleg. Stone bruise or worse. I need you to look at him right now, before they put a rider on him." Whitfield said, "I need clearance from the production office too." Wayne said, "I'll wait while you get your bag." There is something in that exchange that gets to the core of who John Wayne was in moments of principle. He did not argue about clearance. He did not dismiss the process. He simply repositioned the reality. You will get your bag. That is what will happen next. The question is only how long it takes. Whitfield got his bag. The two men walked back over the ridge together. Whitfield examined General's left foreleg for 6 minutes. He found a severe stone bruise at the junction of the hoof wall and sole, with early-stage bruising extending into the white line, the area where hoof wall meets the sensitive internal structures. Working the horse on rocky terrain would have caused, in Whitfield's professional assessment, either a hoof abscess within 24 hours or a fracture of the coffin bone within 72. In plain terms, the horse would have been permanently crippled. Wayne stood behind Whitfield during the examination. He did not speak. He did not look at Foss, who was standing 15 feet away. He did not look at Curtis, who had now walked up and was standing just outside the examining circle. He watched Whitfield's hands. When Whitfield stood up and delivered his assessment, the silence on that set took on a different quality. Charlie Weaver said, at his retirement dinner, that it was the kind of silence that has a specific weight to it, the weight of 87 people reassessing what they thought they knew. Curtis spoke first. He said in his thick Hungarian accent, "How long for a replacement horse?" Harlan Bates, the livestock coordinator, said 3 hours. "Maybe 4. Curtis nodded. He looked at Wayne. Wayne was looking at General, one hand still resting on the horse's neck. This is the moment that Pete Armendariz Jr. said he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Not what happened next, but what Wayne did in this moment, which was nothing. He did not turn to the director with any expression of vindication. He did not look at Gerald Foss. He did not perform satisfaction or resolution. He stood with his hand on a horse in 114-degree heat and waited for the situation to find its own level. That's not stubbornness. That's not ego. That's a man who understood the difference between a principle and a performance. The replacement horse, a 6-year-old quarter horse named Ranger, pulled from a secondary string at the staging area, arrived at the filming position at 1:17 p.m. Production resumed at 1:44 p.m. The sequence they shot that afternoon, under revised light that Curtis' cinematographer actually preferred, was completed in 4 takes. It was one of the cleaner shooting days of the entire production. General was transported by trailer to a veterinary facility in Barstow that evening. He was treated, rested for 6 weeks, and returned to full working condition. He lived another 9 years. Wayne never mentioned the incident in any interview, on any talk show, in any profile published during his lifetime. Not once. The room went quiet in a different way. The way rooms go quiet when the person who had every right to speak chooses not to. At approximately 4:30 p.m. on July 12th, after the cameras were secured and the crew had begun the breakdown for the evening, Michael Curtis asked to speak with Wayne privately. They walked together to a spot about 60 feet from the nearest crew member, a flat stretch of hardpan where a single Joshua tree threw a narrow band of shade. Curtis was not a sentimental man. He had directed more than 160 pictures. He had managed the egos of Errol Flynn and Humphrey Bogart and James Cagney. He had been screamed at, had screamed back, had been taken to court, and had taken others to court. He was dying of cancer, and he knew it, and that knowledge had given him a quality of bluntness that went past professional and into something more fundamental. He said to Wayne, "You cost me 4 hours today." Wayne said nothing. Curtis said, "I need to. No, it won't happen again." Wayne looked at the Joshua tree. He was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that, by now, everyone on the production had learned to read as thought rather than avoidance. Then he said, without looking at Curtis, "It won't happen again if we don't give it a reason to happen again." Curtis absorbed that. Then he said, and this is the line that Roy Calhoun would repeat verbatim at every opportunity for the rest of his life, having been told it secondhand by a grip who was standing close enough to hear. "What do you think I was going to do?" Wayne turned and looked at him directly for the first time since they'd started walking. He said, "I think you were going to get a full day's shooting done." Curtis was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, not with defensiveness, but with the tone of a man filing something away, "And you think that's not sufficient?" Wayne said, "I think it's most of it." The two men stood in the Joshua tree shade for perhaps another 2 minutes without speaking. Then Curtis extended his hand. Wayne shook it. They walked back to the production vehicles separately, a few minutes apart. Curtis told his script supervisor that evening, a woman named Dolores Mayfield, who recorded it in her personal journal, that he had spent 40 years in Hollywood learning to protect the picture. Every decision on every set he had ever run was made in service of the picture. And that afternoon, For the first time in 40 years, someone had made him consider that protecting the picture might require, occasionally, protecting something that the picture depended on, something outside the frame. He said he wasn't sure Wayne was right. He said he was sure Wayne believed it. Dolores Mayfield wrote in her journal, "Curtis said something I've never heard him say before. He said, 'That man sees what I don't see.' I don't know if that's a quality or a liability, but I know now which one of us was right today." Roy Calhoun shook Wayne's hand at the end of the shoot day, without preamble or speech. Wayne shook it, nodded once, and went to his trailer. That was sufficient. That was, in fact, exactly sufficient. Years later, specifically in the spring of 1971, Roy Calhoun was working as a livestock coordinator on a Western television production shooting near Tucson, Arizona. A young production assistant, 24 years old and 3 months into his first real job in the industry, was told by a director to put a horse back into service 36 hours after it had slipped on a creek bottom and strained its right shoulder. The production vet had cleared it for light work. The director wanted it for a chase sequence. The production assistant went to Roy Calhoun and asked him what to do. Calhoun looked at the horse for about 90 seconds. Then he told the young man this: "There is a difference between what you are permitted to do and what you are responsible for. The paperwork says the horse is cleared. The paperwork doesn't walk 40 miles of rocky desert." He told the young man about John Wayne on the Mojave in 1960, about a stone bruise and a replacement horse and a director who shook a man's hand at the end of a day and never mentioned it publicly. He said, "The lesson isn't about horses. The lesson is about what you choose to see when you have the option of not seeing it." The young production assistant pulled the horse from the sequence. He called it himself, without going back to the director. He found the words for it, and he held the position. His name was Dennis Connolly. He went on to become a production supervisor on 6 major studio westerns through the 1970s and 1980s. He was known, universally, among the wranglers and livestock coordinators who worked those productions, as the man who would walk the set himself before calling an animal ready. He is not a famous name. He is not a story the trades ever wrote. But every wrangler who worked with him learned a version of the same thing Roy Calhoun learned from John Wayne on July 12, 1960. That you see what you allow yourself to see. That authority is not the same as understanding. That the man who walks away from the camera to look at something nobody else is looking at is not abandoning his responsibility. He is fulfilling a deeper one. Michael Curtiz finished the Comancheros in October 1960. He died on April 10, 1962, 16 months after the picture wrapped. His last completed film. In the weeks before his death, he gave a series of interviews to a French film critic who was writing about his career for a retrospective journal. In one of those interviews, published in French and never fully translated into English, Curtiz was asked what he would do differently if he could return to any production in his career. He said a great many things. He talked about Casablanca, about Flynn, about the Warner Brothers years. But at the end of the conversation, when the critic asked if there was anything small he would change, "Any single moment," Curtiz said. "There was a horse in the desert. Someone knew before I did. I would have known sooner." The critic didn't understand the reference. It wasn't explained. It remained in the transcript and was forgotten. Until now. Return to that image. 87 people standing in 114-degree heat on hardpan rock and desert scrub. The camera still rolling. A figure disappearing over a ridge. 30 seconds of silence before anyone called cut. The question was, what did he see? He saw what was in front of him. He saw what the schedule and the budget and the authority structure of a $3.2 million production had made it convenient not to see. He saw a horse that could not speak for itself, and a man who had spoken for it and been dismissed. He saw a moment where walking away from the camera was the only honest thing left to do. One moment of clarity. One decision no one could take back. One lesson that cost 4 hours and lasted a lifetime. Not every story about John Wayne involves a fight. Some of the most powerful ones involve a walk. But there is one moment, one confrontation on a different set, in a different decade, where Wayne made a choice that had nothing to do with horses or schedules or the desert heat. A choice that cost him something far more significant than a morning's shooting. And the person he made it for never knew he made it at all. That story, the one Wayne never told, and the one the person at the center of it only pieced together 20 years after the fact. That's a story for another time.